Nenhum país gasta tanto em saúde como os Estados Unidos, e nenhum povo toma tantos remédios como os americanos. Então, por que eles não são os mais sadios e campeões da vida longa? Mexer com a saúde deles é um perigo. Os planos de reforma debilitaram o governo Clinton e os remédios de Bush são caros e amargos, mas engolidos com prazer pela indústria farmacêutica. Marcia Angell é uma doutora que desconfia de remédios e mais ainda dos seus grandes fabricantes americanos e europeus. Um grupo conhecido como The Big Pharma, os 10 maiores da indústria. Marcia Angell não é uma médica comum. Ela é professora em Harvard. Foi editora da The New England Journal of Medicine, a mais influente revista americana sobre medicina. Escreveu o livro The Truth About the Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. A verdade sobre a indústria farmacêutica, como ela nos engana e como agir.
Dr. Angell, help us get the pulse of the American health system. Are you healthier and living longer than the rest of us?
No, we're less healthy and we're not living as long. And that's the tragedy because we spend roughly twice as much per person on health care as any other advanced country. I think about twice what the average is for the OECD countries, this club of rich countries.
Well, the average, what you're talking about, 4,000, 5,000 a year?
Oh, we're spending about 6,000 a year.
6,000.
And the other countries are spending about 3,000. But we're not getting results for this. We're not getting our money's worth. If you look at the outcomes, we're doing worse than the other OECD countries. We're near the bottom of that list.
What are the major health problems that the Americans have? Are they different than the
No,
others?
they're pretty much the same. And people often say, well, we're getting older, but in fact, our population is younger than the population of the other OECD countries. So it's not that.
It's not that. It's a very complex system, the American health system.
But that's a nice way of putting it. It's a crazy system.
Yeah, it's different than the rest of the world.
It certainly is. It is the only healthcare system that is market-based, that looks at healthcare as just one more commodity that you sell in a free market. Now, it's not really a free market because it's heavily subsidized.
Right.
But still, this is the notion that this is a market commodity, and like any other market commodity, it ought to be distributed according to the ability to pay, or to find some third party who'll pay. And then at the same time, we have maybe 46 million people who have no health insurance whatsoever.
Now, help us to understand the American health system. What are the foundations of the system and where is the weakness?
Well, what it's based on is health insurance provided by hundreds, maybe thousands, of competing investor-owned private insurance companies. And how do they compete? They compete not by increasing quality, but they compete by decreasing services.
Like what?
Well, they say we're not going to cover HIV/AIDS. We're not going to cover heart transplantation. What they're trying to do is avoid sick people. But this is the only healthcare system in the world based on avoiding sick people. They want what we call cost shift. They want to get rid of the sick people and make some other element in the system pay for it.
But it has always been like that, or it had major changes on the way there?
It's been a fairly gradual change. It's always had this element, certainly. But it's become much worse since, the failure of the Clinton health plan, I would say.
Were you in favor of that plan, by the way?
No, I was not, because what they were trying to do is outsmart themselves. They were trying to say, well, we're going to leave the private health insurance industry in place, and we're going to give them half a loaf. We're going to regulate them more tightly. We're going to make sure that everybody gets health care, but they still get to be making a profit off of that. And as soon as you allow them a place at the table, they're going to want the whole thing. And that's what they did. They said, why should we settle for half a loaf when we can have the whole loaf of bread? And so they started a huge public relations campaign to scare people about the Clinton plan. And you couldn't defend the Clinton plan in a sense because it was too complicated.
Too complicated.
So the public couldn't get their minds around it, and it was very hard to make an argument for such a complicated plan.
You have concentrated your criticism on the drug companies.
Yes.
Recently you had a book about them. Basically, what's the problem with them? We tend to think that if it's an American new drug, it must be good.
Please don't think that. Please don't think that.
But from what I read, it's the wrong.
Yes, yes.
It's just a perception.
Yes. Moreover, there's nothing American about this industry. This is a global industry. Of the top 10 drug companies in the world, 5 are American, but 5 are European. And some of the biggest ones are European. They all have the United States as their biggest profit center. And so they like to wear the American flag over their shoulders.
You call them the Big Pharma, the American and the Europeans. Are they much different?
Exactly the same.
The same thing.
Right. Because it's a global industry and they behave the same way.
So when there is a new drug on the market, it tends to come, doesn't matter, comes from the U.S. or comes from Europe?
No, doesn't matter where it comes
Doesn't matter.
They charge twice as much in the United States.
Right.
They all market here. Marketing is not directly to the public is forbidden in other countries, but not here. And if you look at their annual reports, you find essentially the same kind of figures. If you look at their budgets, if you carve up their budgets into 4 categories, what it costs them to actually make and distribute the drugs, that is the manufacturing costs, would be one. Another would be research and development, and another would be marketing and administrations, and the fourth would be profits. You find that of those 4 pieces, the smallest is research and development. They always talk as though that's a big thing.
You have the impression that you have the best research and you invest more on research than any other place in the world. That's not true.
Well, we do, but it's publicly funded research. The NIH is
so
wonderful.
the taxpayers are supporting
That's
them.
right,
So
twice.
it's not the drug companies that are really investing their money on research.
But European companies are starting to bring their research efforts into the United States precisely so they can feed on publicly funded research. If you look at any of the big universities, you'll see that the large drug companies are building centers around those universities so they can feed off of NIH-supported research.
So
and that's what they do.
People give the money to the government. The government supports the NIH, which is National Institute of Health.
Right, and most of their money goes to the universities. The NIH supports research in the universities all over the country and all over the world.
So how do the drug companies end up having rights to those?
Well, how indeed? They can license the discoveries of NIH-funded research. Now, this has been possible since 1980. So they can license the discoveries and then have exclusive marketing rights, monopoly rights. And that's exactly what they do. They are not innovative at all. They talk as though they were, but the real innovation comes from university and government labs.
How many new drugs come into the market a year?
Approved by the FDA. That's what we're looking at. Because
FDA
in
is
order,
the federal drug
right, it's the
administration.
regulatory agency,
Right.
the government regulatory agency, which is supposed to make sure that prescription drugs are reasonably safe and effective. So in order for any drug company, wherever the drug company is located in the world, in order for any drug company to sell its drugs in the United States, and of course they all want to do that because this is where they can make the greatest profits, they have to show the FDA in clinical trials, in research, that their new drug is reasonably safe and effective. They have to give that evidence to the FDA. And then the FDA will approve the drug, and then it can be sold in this country.
Sounds reasonable. Sounds good.
It is reasonable. It is good. It is good. That part, so far, so good. And I would say roughly 100 drugs a year, new drugs, are approved. But they're not really new drugs. That's the interesting part of this story. When the FDA approves a new drug, it classifies it according to whether it's likely to be an improvement over existing drugs to treat the same condition, or whether it's just one more, what we call Me Too drugs.
Me Too.
Me Too, or copycat.
I see.
Too meaning, hey, I got one too.
Uh-huh.
And they classify each new drug as to whether it's likely to be an improvement over existing drugs. That's one way they classify it. And the second way, they classify it according to whether it's a new drug at all, or whether it's just an old drug, the old chemical, in a new dosage form, for example, or a new kind of pill. And if you look at the last 8 years, you can find this on the FDA's website. Each year, how many drugs are approved and how they're classified. You'll find that over the last 8 years, fully 80% of the drugs that are new to the market are classified as not being likely to be better than existing drugs. And you find that 70% aren't even new drugs at all, just the same old chemicals.
Isn't the FDA supposed to control these drugs? It does not compare that drug with the other drugs?
That's right. That's right. They don't say this is going to help the population. They say that 80% in fact probably won't help the population. It won't be an improvement over existing drugs. But that isn't what their charge is. Their charge is simply to say whether the drug is reasonably safe and effective. Not compared with existing drugs.
The other drugs.
But compared with a sugar pill, with a placebo.
I
So
see.
that's a very low standard. And one of the things that concerns me is that for all we know, year by year, each drug in a Me Too family may be worse than the one before.
On this, you mentioned that the amount of money and the budget of the drug companies, and you divided them in four. Are they making huge profits?
Huge.
Are they?
Huge. For right up until 3 years ago, they were every year #1 on the Fortune 500 list of most profitable industries in the United States. Fortune 500, Fortune magazine lists the 500 biggest companies every year in the United States. And then they also list 50 industries, and according to their profits. And the pharmaceutical industry, year after year after year, was #1. Now, in 2003, it fell to 3rd place, and I think...
Why was that?
Well, because we had a war in Iraq, and suddenly petroleum and mining and these things. Right. So it wasn't that the pharmaceutical industry was doing less well so much as the petroleum industry, Halliburton.
So they are doing very well right now.
Very well. Last year, for the 9 companies, U.S. companies listed in the Fortune 500, their profits were about 16% of sales, 16%, whereas the median for all the industries was about 6%, so almost 3 times more profitable.
Now, what does the Congress do? The Senate and the House?
They do whatever the pharmaceutical industry wants them to do. It's
that much, huh?
Oh, yes.
The lobby is so powerful.
It's so powerful. Biggest lobby in Washington. And Congress doesn't do anything that this industry doesn't want it to do. Never goes against this industry. A good example is this Medicare prescription drug benefit.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've heard of that.
It's very difficult. It's confusing.
I was telling you about the healthcare system, and I was concentrating on the private part of the healthcare system. If you're under 65, you don't get health care from the government unless you're very, very poor. Then Medicaid will pay for it. But people who are over 65 do have a single-payer government-financed system called Medicare. That's the good thing about becoming 65.
It's a good system?
Yes, it's relatively a good system.
Yeah.
Now, the Bush administration is doing everything it can to undermine the system because they want to show that the government can't do anything right, and they can make that a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they're in the process of more or less dismantling it. But until the Bush administration, this was the most popular, the most effective, the most efficient part of the U.S. healthcare system. Well, what Bush has done and Congress has done is to, for the first time, add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. This was one of the big weaknesses beforehand, that older people had to pay for prescription drugs out of pocket. Well, no more, ostensibly. They now have a prescription drug benefit as a part of Medicare.
And we should say that drugs here are expensive, huh?
Very expensive, very expensive. But this benefit is not everything it was supposed to be by any means. And one of the worst parts of this, and this was a gift from Congress to the drug companies, was a prohibition against bargaining with drug companies for lower prices. That is an explicit provision.
So the government cannot bargain.
Cannot bargain. Whatever the drug companies want to charge, they get to charge, and the government will pay for it. Now, this is an extraordinary thing, because if you look at Medicare, the government bargains for doctors' fees. In fact, it regulates doctors' fees. It sets them.
Yeah.
It regulates hospital reimbursement. But somehow prescription drugs can't be regulated.
But we are here at Harvard Public Health School of Public Health, and across the street is the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy. Why is the academic world is not saying what you are saying about the drug companies? Are you a lonely voice there on this fight? Because there are others that are
but fairly lonely.
Oh, yes?
And it's a matter of following the money. The medical schools are now also on the payroll of the pharmaceutical industry. They receive a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry, and so do individual faculty members. They have multiple consulting arrangements. They are in speakers bureaus. They're on sometimes boards of directors of the pharmaceutical companies. So the financial entanglements between the academic medical centers and the drug companies are pervasive. It's ubiquitous. And, you know, the drug companies get what they pay for. I don't want to suggest that every doctor is being bribed. I think that the doctors genuinely believe the same sort of stuff that the public believes. They watch the same ads on television. They talk to the very attractive sales representatives who come to visit them every day in their offices. They're handed a lot of material that suggests that one drug is better than another. They are no longer getting much education in medical schools about drugs. The medical schools used to be responsible for teaching young doctors pharmacology. Now they're just letting the drug companies do that. Not very much. The drug companies have picked up this slack, and they have convinced the medical profession that somehow they are simultaneously selling drugs and also providing impartial education about the drugs. Now, that can't be. And doctors are smart people, and in any other walk of life, they know that you wouldn't look to a company for education about a product it sells. I mean, you don't go to the Toyota dealer to find out whether a Toyota is better than a Honda. And anybody knows that. And yet somehow the drug companies have gotten away with convincing the doctors that they simultaneously sell a product and also provide impartial education about that same product. Now, in order to convince smart people of something so preposterous, they have to grease that with a lot of money, and that's what they do.
Say one good thing about the drug companies. Is there anything you can say?
Well, I think they are pretty good at putting their pills into bottles. So, no, it's not that we don't need drug companies. We do need drug companies. But they are being rewarded as though they did something they don't do. That is, as though they were creating miracle drugs. And they're not. They are, in terms of their innovative drugs, they come almost entirely from research done in government university labs or in small biotech companies. And the drugs that the drug companies do actually create and put on the market tend to be Me Too drugs. And then after that, it's a fairly easy matter for the drug companies to keep jiggering a molecule so that they create the same drug over and over again.
What is the future? Are you going to win or are you going to lose this battle? It's going to be a progressive thing, more and more profits for the drug companies, less and less innovation?
It can't be more and more profits in the sense that we're running out of people to pay for it. Mm-hmm. The insurance companies no longer want to pay for it. People can't afford to pay for it out of pocket. Our government is broke, and there's going to be some pushback on this Medicare prescription drug benefit because we won't be able to afford it.
So the thing is that it's going to collapse eventually.
Well, something is going to happen, and I wish I knew what was going to happen. I also think that the public is becoming progressively disillusioned. Mm-hmm. They know now that they can get drugs from Canada for about half the price. They know that this prescription drug benefit is a giveaway, really, to the pharmaceutical and the private insurance industries. They are beginning to smarten up. The problem is that Americans, and maybe Brazilians too, have this bias that new is always better than old. So if you say this is the newest drug, they have this belief it's going to save their lives. And right now what the drug companies are trying to do, instead of increase prices, is to increase volume by convincing more and more Americans that there's something wrong with them, that they have some medical condition that requires lifelong treatment. And so the doctor becomes used to that drug. You become used to that drug. You may think it's saving your life.
I hope it does, Doctor. Thank you very much. You've been very kind.
You're quite welcome.